So I think one of the things that is really exciting about ACAN and is probably our point of difference to other architecture built environment based um, people in this space is the ability and desire to collaborate with multidisciplinary people. And this brings in Simon. So Simon Quilty has spent 20 years working as a doctor in the Northern Territory, mainly in remote locations. He has a background in engineering, and this background has shaped his approach to medicine and well-being, and more generally. Over the past decade, living and working in Katherine and Alice, his focus became more and more attuned to the foundations of the problems that he was seeing in hospital every day: homelessness, overcrowding, and almost completely unrecognisable impact of colonisation, and how Aboriginal people have been forced to live in dwellings not suitable to climate. Simon has collaborated closely with his good mate, Norman Frank Jupurrurla, he's going to hate me for getting that wrong, founder of Wilya Janta, and is now the CEO of this organisation. He is in the final stages of a PhD at ANU, examining the relationship between heat and health, with his research honing into deep deficits in housing, and he is a medical advisor for Purple House. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pretty dangerous looking number 7 boomerang behind you.
Yeah, thanks to Joseph for that one.
Yugi, yeah. It's a big show in ACAN in Melbourne later this year. I'll share my screen. Thanks for, I guess I'm pretty eccentric by your definition there, Tim. I spent quite a bit of time as a kid in remote Northern Territory as a young child, and with the eyes of a young child, I witnessed and understood that the Aboriginal people the Aboriginal kids that I played with had this otherworldly wisdom to me, and I wanted to know more. And so I did an engineering degree at Sydney Uni to try and make my car go faster, and realised that was pretty boring. And by the end of worked for a couple of years as an engineer, and realised this deep yearning to understand remote Central Australia, particularly the Katherine region and Tennant Creek. So I did a medical degree and moved to the Northern Territory in early 2000s, and I spent most of the last 20 years there. And we're just going to give you a flavour of what we're doing at Wilya Janta, and custodianship is a lot of what Michael was just saying. It really resonated with me. It's my experience now of certainly Warramunga people that it's just such an otherworldly and incredible view of deep wisdom. So let me just start with this slide. So this is back in 2006. I was the ambulance driver. Norm was the ambulance driver. I was a doctor at a Utopia in Central Australia. And I moved out there, I was given this architecturally designed 3-bedroom house, wraparound verandas, air-conditioned throughout, beautifully equipped, and Norm was my neighbour. He was on call 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. He was also the qualified mechanic that kept a fleet of 6 ambulance troop carriers in alignment. And he lived in a tin shed with no power or water. He was born in the same year as me. And his father, Jimmy Frank Sr., fought the Warramunga land claim, which was the most bitterly contested land claim in Australian history. And he was a deeply cultural man. And he refused to let his children go to school. And so Norm can't read or write. But he is a genius. He has a photographic memory. And it didn't take me very long to realise that I was in the presence of an incredibly great man, and he's been my mentor for close to 20 years now. And in this photograph, you can see his house in the background. You can see the hoses running up through a boarded window so that they can keep some of the heat out. The tin shed was uninsulated. And what he's doing is actually teaching me about a very sacred part of the kangaroo bone. When you kill a kangaroo on Ayora country, you have to break the leg so it doesn't chase you in the dreaming. There's a lot of culture around the preparation of food. What Norm didn't tell me, he was teaching me a lot of language, and he was also teaching me a lot of cooking skills and hunting skills. He's a Warramunga man, and he was living on a Yawara country. And when you live on another person's country, you speak their tongue and you follow all of their laws, including how you cook up a kangaroo. I didn't realize this at the time, but Norm was teaching me on Yawara culture. So when Norm moved back to Tennant Creek and I started spending time with him there, I was perplexed and like, Norm, I thought it was done this way. And he's like, no, Simon, that's a Yawara. He didn't even think to tell me. He just thought that I would know. And over the years, he has this otherworldly wisdom, and he seems to know when things are going to go wrong. And there's certainly some phenomenon that I dare not try to describe that are incredibly powerful. But for instance, I was driving at a Utopia in my old Kingswood. I was driving the back way up through Pungalindum, and the night before, I'd seen these flashes of lightning right off in the distance. And so I drove off early in the morning and went through this long puddle and got bogged. And about 10 minutes later, Norm pulled up behind me. He's like, Simon, I knew you get bogged there. And I said, how did you know it was raining? He said, oh, that storm. I knew it was about 100 k's north. I knew this puddle would be full. I knew you'd get bogged. And he has this ecological wisdom that is just extraordinary. And it is the collection of 60,000 years of wisdom that is handed through signs and totems and storytelling at night. And it still absolutely exists in Central Australia. And so in 2020, I moved down to Alice Springs with my family after having spent 8 years at Katherine Hospital. And we stayed with Norm. I'm the only doctor, so I'm probably the only white fellow that I know that regularly stays in town camps with my friends. And Norm's house is a place of pride and incredibly resilient strength in the way that people live despite extreme adversity. And Norm's been on dialysis for 10 years. Tennant Creek has the highest rates of kidney failure in the world and the highest rates of rheumatic heart disease in the world. And it's because of extreme poverty. Poverty is the same level as in sub-Saharan Africa, only we give them just enough to stop people getting florid malnutrition. And I feel that that's starting to change. And so Norm put us in the living room on 2 double mattresses that were butted up against the eastern facing wall, which had no eaves on it. On the 2nd and 3rd of January when we stayed there, it was 40 degrees by 9 a.m. and that sun beat down on that solid concrete wall, Caulfield Besser brick, all day long, at least until lunchtime. And by lunchtime, that wall was hot enough that you couldn't really hold your hand to it for too long. And I slept underneath that wall, and the wall radiated heat in the room all night, and this air conditioner buzzed all night, an air conditioner that Norman fitted himself, fighting the wall. And that number 4 that you can see on the wall behind us there is his power meter. And Aboriginal people pre-purchase their power cards, and when the power disconnects, when the power runs out, the credit runs out, the power disconnects. And if that happens at midnight, then suddenly I realised the implications for my own family. I was well aware of this problem. I bought lots of my friends and Katherine power cards when they asked. And all of a sudden I was faced with it with my children. Now, I'd like to point out as well that Norm has been sponsoring 2 African children for the last 6 years for $30 a month. This is the level of generosity that I am completely accustomed to now, and I find it quite hard coming back to places like Sydney. Norm describes white fellas as muncho, or greedy, and indeed I agree with him. So when after that experience, Norm would stay regularly at my house in Katherine and in Alice Springs, and it was the first time he'd spent a lot of time in a well-insulated house. He saw the solar panels on my roof. He discovered that I didn't run out of power all the time. And my house was well designed. It had reflective white paint and wraparound verandas. And he said to me, I want solar panels like yours. And so Norm's is the first and only house in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal house, to have solar panels on its roof, Aboriginal public housing house. The Northern Territory government has subsequently shut down any avenue for Aboriginal people to put solar panels on their roof after this one example. They did say that they plan to roll out a solar trial in Tennant Creek to prove that it works in 2033. So if you fly into Alice Springs or Tennant Creek and you see all of those solar panels on half of the roofs, you can tell what colour the occupants are inside that house. And this is Australia. This is the one and only house that has solar panels on its roof. And Norm said to me at the end, well, I want to go further. The problem is the house. It doesn't represent my culture and it doesn't represent my people. And he asked me to build a house. Now, it was a pretty exciting prospect. I was like, fuck, I don't know how I'm going to get the money, Norm, but let's start. And so it all comes around this principle of cultural protocol. The core cultural protocol in Tennant Creek, when the weather dried up, the 13 clan groups had a very particular way of relating to each other. It was incredibly well detailed in a law that was ancient. And this is a story of Jalawara and Giliji. You can find out more about this on our website. But there's songlines and there's totemic relationships and there's clan groups that connect in perfect harmony if traditional law is followed. And Wilya Janta, the organisation that I now work for, is based very much foundation along those lines. And it is about, so Wilya Janta means standing strong or standing together. And it means we all stand together. And it specifically means non-Indigenous people working with Indigenous people, both of us bringing our strengths to the table. And I think what's really interesting, in places like Tennant Creek, no one has ever asked Aboriginal people how to live well in a hot climate, which is pretty phenomenal, really, given the extent of the ecological and climatic knowledge that Aboriginal people have, that no one has ever thought to involve them in the design of the homes. So just a quick oversight of what's been happening in Tennant Creek. This was a photograph taken in Paul Memmett's book in 1970 in ACAN. And when I showed Norm this picture, he said, yeah, that's how I grew up a lot when I was at a bush camp. There was a whole lot of principles of using local materials to protect yourself against the cold winds in winter and the hot sun in summer, and where you moved close to water in the hot weather. And it was in perfect harmony, man and the environment, human beings and the environment. In 1930s, colonisation came in, Aboriginal people were kicked off ancestral lands, and they had to move on to cattle stations for their own safety. And then in 1968, equal wages came in, and all the Aboriginal workforce across the Barkly, across Central and Northern Australia, were ejected from the cattle stations, and they started fringe dwelling in buildings like this. I took this photograph in Katherine in 2019, just before I went to Norm's house. Uninsulated, single cavity. It does have power. It doesn't have a toilet. And there are about 20 people living in that without any insulation, not even a ceiling inside. And that's the best that we can do for Warlpiri people in Warlpiri camp. And so what happened in the early 1970s, as Paul Memmott can explain, is that the government started to realise they had a problem on their hands, and they started building houses. And Norm can describe his grandfather moving into a house exactly like this and how he didn't know how to operate. He, as an old man, he had never considered that he wouldn't spend every night of his life under the stars. That was Norm's grandfather. That's how Norm also grew up. He's my age. He's 50 years old. And so Norm is very clear that houses have caused the problems, the health problems that these people suffer from. Rheumatic heart disease didn't exist in Tennant Creek, nor did renal failure before 1970s when houses were introduced. So at Wilya Janta, we have done a review of 21 remote area projects. This is a house in Karan that was built in the 70s. It was actually quite a good design. We took 25 Warramunga people, a bunch of architects and journalists out to Central Arnhem Land in Bullman to look at these houses. These are the only houses in the Northern Territory that are actually genuinely designed and built by Aboriginal people, and they are beautiful. They're maintained and look like the same day they were built back in the 1980s. But there's lots of problematic architecture as well. Many of you will know that this is Murcutt's house, the Bundak Marika house out at Yirrkala, built in the early 1990s for well over $1 million, completely unreplicable for the whole community. So Bundak Marika, who was a very famous artist, passed away a couple of years ago. She was given this house, and she was given the diamond in the rough, and it made no one's life better. And completely unreplicable house. And it also wasn't really it didn't really click in to give Aboriginal people true agency to design their house. This was much more of an ego project than it was about formulating new ways that Aboriginal people could live, but also in the process teaching non-Indigenous people how to be better custodians of the land that we now inhabit as well. And so thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Aboriginal people back in the day using upper water was fundamental. Country provides, safety needs were met by collectivism and sharing. The love and belonging that I feel in places like Tennant Creek is extraordinary. I am family. I'm loved there like I'm loved nowhere else. And the esteem and the self-actualization of people like Norman Frank Jupurrurla and all of the founders of Wilya Janta is truly breathtaking. The most self-actualized people I have ever met by a very long way. And so these are some Maori people living in that brown house in Katherine that I showed you before. They're absolutely self-actualized, but their safety and physiological needs are absolutely not being met. And so I've been doing a PhD. I won't go into too much detail about it, but Norm and I have had some pretty high-profile publications. I was going to give you a slide there somewhere, but I've lost it. Basically, my research shows I've looked at 40,000 deaths over remote Northern Territory, and what we found is that Aboriginal people, despite these really serious inequities in access to safe homes and built infrastructure, are much more resilient and much less likely to die from hot weather than non-Indigenous people. And us non-Indigenous people, we are getting more vulnerable with time. And it's because we're building dwellings that exclude us from the environment and accept us. We are physiological entities, and we adapt to climate. And Aboriginal people have a whole sociocultural way of dealing with climate that we should be listening to, but almost nobody is. I'd like to point out that there's been a recent $4 billion announcement. This was in the tender documents for the supply chain of how these houses are going to be built in the next 10 years. If you don't know what this is a tin box that fits through a Besser brick wall to allow the residents to purchase a box air conditioner to keep their house cool, because the Northern Territory government refuses to install air conditioning in the hottest parts of the Northern Territory. The reason that I'm pointing this out, because these really are political problems, right? A couple of weeks ago, your National Institute, the Australian Institute of Architects, had a dinner and debate in Darwin about the built environment. And it was hosted for the Chief Minister, Evelyn Lawler, and the Leader of the Opposition. And in that event, there was not one single question asked about the appalling brief and tender documents that the Northern Territory government had released about a $4 billion spend that's going to define remote Northern Territory for the next 10 years. And so that's what Wilya Janta is up against. This is a house that was built in Tennant Creek that Norm's daughter, the lady that you saw in the very first picture, lives in. There were 23 people living in this dwelling. It's NatHERS 4.5. You can see the colour of the paint. There are uneven verandas. They firstly bulldoze the land and cut down all the trees, including 100-year-old cooler bars. Then they compress it to a depth of 3 metres so that no grass ever grows as a means for fire protection and to stop the builders getting bogged. And they are prison-like and terrible. And this house cost $850,000 to build in 2021. And they plan on replicating this model for the next 10 years. And so Wilya Janta is providing another model, thanks primarily to our architects at Office, but we are doing it in a different way. Office is facilitating the design process. We are not following a contemporary architectural process. We are allowing Aboriginal people to lead. And working with the guys at Office, who some of you might know, is an absolute pleasure. There's not many architects in Australia who know how to operate with low-income and socially vulnerable people like Office do. And it is just a beautiful project, working with joy and with open hearts and celebrating Aboriginal culture and learning from it. I won't go into too many details. You can find us on the website and you can see the deep cultural principles of the houses we built in. I'd just like to share this last image. I was shown this picture that Norm's second youngest daughter, Nita, who's 6 years old, brought it home, and all of the grandparents and uncles and aunts were really super impressed. they were like, Simon, look at this picture. I've never seen a kid draw a picture of their house. And Nietzsche's just drawn this picture. It's amazing. Look at it. This is because of Wilya Janta. The children that are watching Norman and Serena design their first house are the first Warramunga children to have ever witnessed this. And this is where some of these things start. And this is really digging into how we prepare for climate change. We have people that are totally willing to share their knowledge about it, but we are leaving them in conditions that are so substandard as to be believed. So look, I hope that kind of stimulates some thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation at the end of this.
Thanks, Simon. Some fascinating insight into the work you're doing up
Yeah.
in Tennant Creek.
Totally fantastic, Simon, that connection between health and housing, I think, will become more and more critical for vulnerable people in the cities. And I think if only more architecture students did drawings like neater, bottom up rather than top down. And I've good to hear that you've got a good relationship with Office.